Hey guys, this is Matt Core from ControlPaint.com, and I'm really excited about this series. This is a very fundamental skill that is going to build on what you've done with Basic Rendering 1, but now we're going to take it into a different direction. Because in the previous series we talked about rendering simple matte surface objects with a simple lighting setup. And for a variety of reasons, I really think this is the core of your ability to render. Because on this foundation, you're going to be able to advance to complicated forms, complicated lighting, complicated materials. The only problem though is that so far we've really only talked about doing this from direct observation. Whether you're using a photo or looking at a physical object, those skills are only going to get you so far in terms of illustration. And we need to be able to do all of these same techniques from our imagination. This tanker truck here is a great example of our goal. Now, you don't need to be really concerned about the complexity of this shape. Don't let that scare you off, because over the course of this series, I'm going to explain how you can render any form, simple or complicated, following really just a few guidelines. Using these guidelines, you'll be able to take your line drawing, imagine a light source, and then render the form. So for the sake of consistency, we're going to be mainly using a similar lighting setup to the one from Basic Rendering 1. It's going to be strong directional light. And then we're going to have a little bit of bounce light filling back in that shadow detail. And since we devoted so much of the last series to talking about how to use the tools, as in how to use Photoshop to blend paint and those sorts of things, in this series we're going to skip the technical talk. For the sake of this series, I'm just going to assume that you either know the basics of digital rendering from elsewhere, or that you've watched the previous series called Basic Photoshop Rendering. And I should also mention that these techniques are totally software agnostic. So if you want to work with GIMP or SCI or Painter or really even traditional media, these techniques are exactly the same. All we're doing is talking about theory. So before we get into specific examples, I just want to show you how short the list really is when it comes to these general rules. So in brief, we have a shadow shape, which consists of a form shadow and a cast shadow. And then where this ends and the illuminated form begins is called the terminator. The cast shadow and the form shadow are not sort of a uniform black. They have a little more detail than that, and that's because there is bounce light filling that detail back in. But it's really these key landmarks that we want. We're looking for the terminator, the edge of the cast shadow, and the form shadow. Because if we can find these key landmarks on a simple form like this one, they are found in the exact same way on complicated shapes. And then when you make a complicated rendering like this one, you're really just doing the same few things over and over. So let's see how we find these crucial landmarks if we don't have reference. So first we're going to need to know the light direction. And for these examples, I'm just going to assume that the rays of light are parallel and far away. So this is like if we had the sun or potentially a very bright spotlight. So the simple crucial rule that drives this entire process is light angle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare the angle of the light to the angle of the surface that it hits. And when you compare those two together, you know something about the illumination. If this angle is very perpendicular, you get a very bright surface. This is where it's the most illuminated. If it is very parallel, then the rays don't even hit the surface, they just pass straight on by, and as a result it's very dark. Now, all of these angles in between here are going to make sort of a gradation of values across the surface of your form, going from dark to the most illuminated where it's the most perpendicular. Another way of saying this is where the light is most tangent to the form. But moving our way back down away from where it's most tangent, at some point you'll hit this area where the light is totally parallel with your surface. And this is called the terminator. This is the beginning of your shadow shape. Everything beyond this point is going to be darkness, or darkness that is filled back in with some bounce light. And the reason for this is because beyond this point, the directional light can't reach your object. And as you know, I love working from simple to complicated. And a great way to apply that notion to light angle is by simplifying the form. So instead of this being a perfect sphere, let's imagine for a second that the profile was a segmented, faceted surface. A quick way to think about this light angle is to imagine little arrows pointing off the centers of these faces. And you'll notice that these arrows here are perpendicular to the surface direction. And then here I have my light direction. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare the light direction to some of these surface arrows. So if I were to compare it to this one right here, you can see that they point directly at one another. And that means that this is where it is the brightest. If I move it here to the next one, you can see the angle they create is a little bit bigger. Moving it down to this next one here, the angle gets bigger still. And if I keep doing that, eventually I'll get to where the terminator is, and you can see what is created here as a 90-degree angle, because the light just keeps on moving and does not hit the form anywhere down here. So when you're thinking about form, imagine these arrows. You'll begin to just have a sort of a mental reaction to when you see the bright area of the form. Well, that means it's sort of looking straight back at the light direction. If it's a little dimmer, the arrow is not looking right at the light direction, it's looking somewhere else. So you can use this as sort of like a little mental trick to quickly determine what is the light angle. Because it doesn't need to be perfect, we're not doing math here. It's really just a rule to guide your imagination. Okay, so what about the cast shadow? How do we know where that gets projected? Well, the way you find the cast shadow is by drawing little imaginary lines from the terminator in the direction of the light, and then you just keep drawing that line until it collides with something. And in this case, what we're going to collide with is the ground plane. So if that's one point, I can just repeat that process a few different times, and I get sort of a connect the dots. And then when I make a shape from those dots, that's my cast shadow. It's really pretty simple. So the general sequence goes, you know where the light is. From that, you can figure out where the light becomes parallel to the form. That gives you the location of your terminator. Everything beyond the terminator is shadow. It's either a form shadow or it's a cast shadow. And the way you figure out where the cast shadow is by projecting some quick lines from the edge of the terminator to the ground plane. And that's it. Really, theoretically, at this point, you could turn the series off because those are the only major rules that allow me to render either a simple form or a complicated one like this. Now, seriously though, I'm going to break these rules down into sort of common forms and real-world scenarios that'll just help you familiarize yourself with the results. But this is all about practice. So we're going to go over these in detail, as well as some homework assignments that are included with this series. So to find those, make sure to look in the resources folder, and you can follow along with the videos and then do some exercises yourself. All right, without further ado, let's go ahead and get into shadow casting and finding the terminator.